Eduardo Suprinyak, and he's going to talk to us about, we've been sort of skirting around what experts really do or what expertise really does, the sort of work that it does. And so we're actually going to have now a very fine analysis of how experts were inserted into a particular instance looking at the trade crisis. But we're going back many years. It's been, now in the 20th century, for a while in the 20th century, now going back to the 17th century. So it's great to have you here and to see you again. Welcome, Charles.
Well, thank you, Sandra and David, for having me. I'm talking about the economic ideas in early 17th century in England. But before I start, I'd like to make a couple of clarifications. As economists, we always tend to internalist history. Well, my effort during what has been in the sense of getting rid of as much internalism as possible. So in that sense, questions such as whether the favorable balance of trade doctrine or Malin's ideas about the exchange markets, if they're in any sense right or wrong, really interest me as a researcher. So I'm interested in trying to understand how these come about and how they are articulated in public discourse. So that's the general view of the analysis. The second one is that, well, the title points to experts, as Sandra already mentioned, and to establish some dialogue with one of the themes that was proposed for this. But obviously there weren't experts in any strict sense in England during the early 17th century. So when I talk about experts, I'm actually talking about people who had extensive knowledge of practical matters. So people had experience and dealt with economic mechanisms and economic phenomena and felt that they knew about that. But this is not a characterization that I'm imposing arbitrarily upon them. I think it is legitimate to call them experts, because although this term does not appear in the literature, these people were actually frequently portraying themselves as experts, as people who had important and necessary knowledge about several mechanisms and phenomena that were important for understanding the way the economy worked. And more than that, besides portraying themselves as experts, as people with expertise, they were actually seen by the crown, by the public authorities, and I'll go venture to say by society at large, as people with expertise. So when the Privy Council of England had to face a problem that had to do with economic matters, that had to do with economic themes, it actually would call on these people and say that they had important inputs to offer because they had practical knowledge. They were knowledgeable in matters that were important to solve these, especially by political authorities, as people with expertise. So I think it's legitimate to call them experts in this sense. But so one consequence of this emphasis on the experts is that this paper will not be so much about economic ideas themselves, but rather about the ways and paths that were open to these people to actually interact and participate in public discourse during this time. So to start, I'd like to offer a short overview of what I'm trying to do here. So I'm talking about a very specific time period, which is in the 20s in England. And this is a period that has been known by historians of economics because of famous controversy between three rather well-known authors, which are Edward Misselden, Malin, and Thomas Mann. So these are very well-known names, at least among historians of economics. And these three authors were engaged in a rather fierce complaints. And the pamphlets that they wrote during this moment, historiographical canon, as sort of symbols of whole mercantilist doctrine. But these works were actually a reaction to a very specific context that England went through at that time. So they were actually a response to a very severe commercial crisis that affected England, well, Europe in general, but England in particular during this period, the late 1610s and early 1620s. So these troubles had obviously the beginning of the 30 Years' War and a series of monetary disturbances that took place in the imperial territories, a phenomenon which has been known in the literature as Privatzeit. So important for the pattern of English very adverse impact on the foreign trade of England, obviously. So England was facing at this time a very serious and severe commercial crisis, and this literature, this controversy, is actually a response to this very specific problem, to the trade crisis that's taking place. So this is a moment when you actually have a very generalized public interest for economic matters, for the discussion of economic topics, economic subjects. So how has the historiography treated these authors? Well, what's the status that they have in the historiography? Well, according to Smith, as most of you certainly know, they were mere interests. That's how Smith saw them. And so Smith gives a very vague characterization of what he calls the system of commerce, the mercantile system. And most of his interpretation, this opinion of these authors as advocates for vested interests, I think is related to the fact that they were actually members of merchant companies, so they had a direct interest in the issues that were being treated. Obviously, the historiography has evolved a lot since then, and well, Weiner, I think, as far as I know, was the first one to call attention to the importance of this very specific context of crisis to the development of this literature. So Weiner, in his classical 1930 article about English theories of foreign trade before Adam Smith, he actually calls attention to the 1620s as an important moment, and he says something. This was perhaps the first moment when a crisis gave rise to economic literature, the debate on economics. And this was probably the last time when these debates impact on public policy. So that's Weiner's interpretation of events. He actually believes that this was a distinctive moment, something that had something very unique and peculiar to it. But the thing is, he offers this interpretation, but he happens to support his claim, so he just states that. So as the historiography evolved through the works of economic historians, and not exactly historians of economics, so we have in the 50s work by people such as J.D. Gould and Larry Seville that have done a lot to clarify these issues, and they have called attention to the importance of a series of public investigative committees that were created to investigate the crisis, both under the supervision of Parliament and under the supervision of the Privy Council of England. So, well, these authors obviously were much more interested in the structure of the committees themselves rather than on the economic authors. But they called attention to the fact that these authors, Mann, they actually took part, they participated, they were members of these investigative committees. So they were together in this effort of public deliberation about the trade crisis. And this is an idea that has been picked up by Lars Magnuson in his very influential 1994 work. And Magnuson says that actually the work that these people did in the committees had a very strong impact on their ideas, in the sense that their ideas were actually formed through being subjected to the work of these committees. But again, Magnuson, he says that this was important, but he does not explore the possibility of how these people got there. This is a question that is not answered. So how could they eventually get, who was selected, who could actually have a say on these debates? So that's a question that Magnuson does not answer. And so I think this is an important open question that remains in the specialist literature, which is the question I'm trying to address here. What were the ways, the paths open for the participation of these so-called experts, these people of business and mercantile origin that felt that they had something important to say about the economy? And more than that, how far could these people actually influence the course of events? So to give you some context, starting with the economic history in the early 17th century. Well, I think it's important to note that, well, the Elizabethan period was actually a period of economic stagnation. It was a period of very difficult conditions for the English economy in a general sense. So this is something that, well, has been established in the works by Jack Fisher and Lawrence Stone and Robert Brenner and other people like that. So the economy, the English economy during the late 16th century was actually growing very slowly or not at all. So this was a period of economic difficulties, of stagnation. With the accession of James I in 1604, this changes a little bit because, well, England had been fighting Spain since 1585, if I'm not mistaken. And well, when James comes to the throne, he immediately signs a peace treaty with Spain. So England's war with Spain is over. And well, what happens is that the war between England and so England benefits from a temporary position of mercantile neutrality between these two mercantile powers, Spain on one hand and the United Provinces on the other hand. So this temporary neutrality serves as a boost for English foreign trade. So this is a moment where conditions for English foreign trade are very good, very prosperous. And so you have 10 years roughly from 1604 to 1613 where the foreign trade of England is growing very fast. So this is a period of economic prosperity for the kingdom in general terms. That stops, that comes to an end in the mid-1620s, beginning with known as the Cocaine Project, which is a project that was executed between 1614 and 1617, and which consisted roughly in an attempt to substitute the exportation of unfinished broadcloths, which were the main export article of England at that time, for the, actually substitute that by the exportation of only finished pieces. So it was an attempt of taking out of the United Provinces and the Flemish territories the workmanship on English cloth, so bringing this craftsmanship inside of England. So this project, it was actually an utter failure. It led to a Dutch boycott on English exports that absolutely ruined the English foreign trade during this short 3 years period. And it actually added an element of frailty to the structure of English cloth, of the English cloth industry. So, what I think is interesting is that this project, it only makes sense because this is a moment of prosperity. This is a project that would never be thought of during the recent times. I mean, people would think that that would be a good thing, but nobody would try to implement that because the conditions were bad. It only comes to fruition in the mid-1610s because economic conditions at this moment were very, very favorable, very prosperous. So this is actually a failed project that arises out of good intentions of a favorable moment. So, as I said, the failure of this project, it kind of shapes this traditional cloth industry, cloth manufacture of England. And what happens is that shortly after the project is revoked in 1617, you have then the eclosion of this very severe commercial crisis, which is related, as I have already said, to the beginning stages of the 30 Years' War, into monetary disturbances in the continent. This is something that has been explained very convincingly by Aristotle in the 60s. So what you have is an inflationary lags between Baltic and German territories, which were the main consumers of English textiles, that actually changed in terms of trade between England and that region for a short while. So English exports to that area became actually more expensive than they should naturally have been. So you have a disincentive to exports in this area. This is by far the most important branch of English foreign trade. So we have this very acute, very severe trade crisis from 1619 to roughly 1623 that is, well, actually related to this problems of exports of cloth textiles. So again, during the early 1620s, there is the generalized interest in economic issues, and I think this interest is justified, as I have roughly said so far, by the close succession of two critical events, which were the Cocaine Project on the one hand, and the actual commercial crisis on the other hand. But also, I think what justifies the very intense public reaction to these difficulties is the fact that in this new context of prosperity, the stagnation had become a much more unbearable burden than it was before. I mean, during the Elizabethan times, stagnation was a very rare, a very common feature, but nobody was complaining very much about it. Obviously, there were debates about economic issues. There was interest in that, but not a generalized public concern that would lead to ample debates in the public arena. Let's put it like that. What happens is that in this new context of prosperity, when you have a lot of economic forces that had lain dormant for a long time finally unleashed, stagnation becomes a sort of an unbearable feature. So there is a much more strong reaction to these difficult conditions. So there are some institutional aspects of England at that time that I also think are very important to understand the context of these debates. Well, the first of them is that the Elizabethan period was actually a moment of growth in nationalism in England, especially regarding foreign trade. So you have this actually relates to the stagnant conditions in international European markets, which led to more rivalry, more strong competition between countries. And so, I think that's very well represented in the gradual removal of the Hanseatic privileges in England that happens during the Elizabethan period. So there is this effort of substituting domestic merchants for foreign merchants. There was this growth and somehow nationalistic feel towards foreign trade. That English trade should be conducted by English merchants. So what happens is that as a consequence of that, you have the dissemination of the model of the merchant company, which is a model that had well, it had already existed during the early 16th century, but it really gets developed really fastly during the late 16th century, during the Elizabethan period. So you had the creation of several new and different merchant companies that actually were put in charge of very specific branches of foreign trade. So we had a company that dealt with the Baltic, you had a company that dealt with the Low Countries, and a company that dealt with Germany, and a company that dealt with the East India, and a company that dealt with the Levant. So we had you separated the branches of foreign trade and put them under the care of a concessionary group of merchants. Basically, that's what it was. And this group is actually responsible for carrying the whole of foreign trade between England and these regions. So what happens as a consequence of that is that you have the emergence of a sort of business elite in the city of London, something that existed in a very feeble form before. So during the Elizabethan period, you have this growth of the mercantile class within the city of London, this class that was in charge of dealing with foreign trade, with English foreign trade. And well, the crown, I'll talk more about that in a minute, but the crown during this period was actually always in need of money. There was a chronic need for finance on the part of the crown. And so after the fall of Antwerp, after the closing of the Antwerp market, which was the main source of public credit until the 58, 57, what happens is that the crown needs to look for other sources of finance. And these sources are found in the city of London, which has this growing business elite. So the city of London becomes the main source for public finances. So what you have is a growth and intensification of the relations between the high public administration on the one hand and the mercantile elite seated in London on the other. So you have, as I said here, close connections between the city and the court. So talking a little bit more about the fiscal problem. As I said, this was a pressing matter throughout the whole of the Stuart period. Actually, it had been a pressing matter also during Elizabethan time, but well, things were a little different back then. But it changes a lot after the Stuart accession. But I think the fundamental issue is that there was a chronic inadequacy of the structure, the budgetary structure of England during this time. Well, for one thing, England had to rely on a very old-fashioned and inadequate income structure. The sources of revenue were very inadequate to deal with the growing necessities of a modern state. So the state functions were increasing. You also have a price revolution. The prices are also increasing. And the sources of revenue that the crown had at its disposal were actually very fixed ones. So it was very difficult to readjust, to obtain more money in the short run. So basically, the main source of revenue was still as a landowner, so through rents and things like that. So I think the most flexible source of income in the short run were the customs tariffs. But the problem is that, well, obviously the crown was very interested in achieving a proper collection of customs tariffs because of that. There was a source of flexible revenue. But even at that point, it was very difficult to actually tap more resources from the city because, well, the collection of resources had to necessarily go through Parliament. So that was an unescapable problem. So it had to go through Parliament, and Parliament during the Stuart period was actually very critical of the court for several reasons. For one thing, when James came to the throne, this is a new dynasty, so he's a foreign monarch, and more than that, he's a foreign monarch who was the son of a hated woman, a woman that was absolutely hated and mostly English subject, which was American and Scots. So there is a lot of antagonism going on at this time, and it actually intensifies because of the patterns of court expenditure that are inaugurated by the Stuart crown, the Stuart monarchy. So the Parliament was also a very during the early Stuart period, it was always very difficult for the crown to obtain revenue from Parliament. If it needed Parliament was always a problem. So the crown actually had to establish more close connections, as I have already said, with the city of London. That was the main source of money in the short run. That's where the crown had to go if it needed credit. So what happens is that you have this marriage of, between the high public administration and the business elite. So the Corporation of London, for instance, frequently serves as either a guarantor for royal credit, offers collateral for credit operations, or else raises credit itself for the crown. So there's a very close connection between the structure during this period and the court officers, the high and harmonious relationship. There was a lot of coercion going on. The crown actually could impose its will on the business elite. So there was a lot of forced loans and things like that. So this was not always a very easy and harmonious relationship. But still, this was a relationship that involved benefits for both sides, because the mercantile elite actually could obtain lots of privileges and lots of concessions from the crown in exchange for its loans, its financial services. But what I think is important about all this is that since the crown actually had a very serious need for finance, that was a pressing matter throughout the whole period, public finance actually becomes the main access to business people to the court. This is the main way open to the entrance of people from the business world into the realm of court, of public service. So I think this is the important point about this. If there was a door that was open for a man of business background to reach court service, and to actually influence the course of public policy, that was public finance. That was the main path open. So, the relationship between the experts and fiscal administration. Well, the administration of public finance, the ordinary dealings of public finance, were actually in the hands of the Lord Treasurer, which was at this time a very prominent and influential figure in public administration. So, as a very prominent post, this was traditionally occupied by high courtiers, by people of aristocratic background, so people who had actually court pedigrees, let's put it like that. But obviously these people, being aristocrats, they had very little experience in practical economic matters. They knew very little about that. Maybe they knew abstractly, but they had very little practical knowledge about how things in financial markets actually worked. So they had to have recourse constantly to the help of people who actually had this kind of knowledge. So you have the rise of this figure, which I have called here the financial agents of the crown. People who would actually help the crown via the Lord Treasurer to administer, to get a hand on financial markets. So that's what they do. They mediate between the state and the credit market. And these were people that were traditionally members of the business elite. That's where they came from. They had the practical knowledge to actually deal with financial markets and financial intermediation. So they had the opportunity to work very closely with the Lord Treasurer and other high officers. This was a way of access to court. They actually could, through their services as financial agents, be very close to the high court service. I think you have a canonical example in the relationship between Lord Burleigh and Sir Thomas Gresham during the Elizabethan period. Lord Burleigh was Lord Treasurer, and Gresham was the financial agent of the crown in Antwerp, in the Low Countries. So Gresham was in charge of doing several things among them, contracting loans, dealing with the merchant adventurers, trying to manipulate the exchange market to realize payments in more favorable terms. So there was a lot of practical things that had to be dealt with, and that was the function of the financial agent, who worked again very closely to the Lord Treasurer. So again, I think the important point is that these people, these financial agents actually could occupy a position very close to the centers of decision of the political world. So, I want to talk a little bit about a figure, this character, which is very important to the story that I'm trying to tell, that I've been trying to tell for some time, and which, as far as I know, is very scarcely known among historians of economics, which is Sir Lionel Cranfield. So, again, coming a little back, during the reign of James I, there is a very rapid and continuous deterioration of the crown's budget. So the financial conditions are gradually worsening. They're worse every day. And you have attempts at parliamentary settlement, you have attempts to dialogue, to establish a connection in parliament, but they're always failing for one or another reason. So parliament is always a blocked road to reach a financial settlement. There was a very famous attempt in 1610 by Lord Salisbury, which is called the Great Contract, the attempt to establish a settlement that would, through which the crown would give up some of its feudal rights in exchange for a fixed amount of money annually. So it's kind of a modern arrangement in some sense. But then that failed due to mutual distrust between the king and the parliament. So the parliamentary role never really worked. It was always, there was always some political, religious, constitutional problem that blocked the possibility of a parliamentary settlement. So again, what happens is that the crown has to find other ways of dealing with this need for money. And one of the most important ways that was found during this period was the concession of the great farm of the customs, which was a general concession of the rights to collect customs tariffs to private parties, private consortiums. So due to this, to the creation of this farm, this practice of farming the customs, you have actually the formation of very powerful business groups in the city, which are formed to actually gain access to this right to collect customs tariffs. So what happens is that in the early 1610s, the first concession of the great farm was actually due. It was about to expire, and so there was a process of renewal. So the crown was trying to renew this concession. And obviously there was a sense that, well, somehow the merchants who actually administered that knew more about the practical dealings of customs collection than the crown itself. So the crown actually called some people to help with the process of renewal in hopes of actually obtaining better terms in this negotiation. So one of these people was Lionel Cranfield, who had been a cloth merchant, a moneylender, public concessionary during the late Elizabethan and early Jacobean period. So he was active in the city since around 1595, I would say, until the early 1610s when he was called to help the crown. And so he was called to help because he actually had been involved in the administration of customs collection during the previous years. And so he knew about these things, and he was called to help the crown in the process of negotiation. And he reviewed fraudulent record-keeping practices by his former associates, so that obviously didn't earn him very many friends in the city, but actually made him very popular at court. So he becomes not influential at this point, but a very solicited figure. So every time the crown had a problem that had to deal with economics, they would call Cranfield to help with that. So what happens is that Cranfield becomes the main crown advisor for economic matters. So every time there is a problem with economics, Cranfield is the man to which the crown goes to. So in the late 1610s, after the ascension of Buckingham as the new favorite of James, so there is a lot of changes and alliances within court. But the problem is that at this point, this was probably the critical point of the financial crisis of the Jacobean reign. This is the point when things really reach the worst level ever. So there was a sense, and Buckingham felt that very strongly, that any successful regime at this point needed a successful financial consolidation. That was the only way of establishing a solid and long-lasting regime. So Buckingham at this point was very interested in promoting financial reforms within the crown, within the court. So he associated himself, and Cranfield had been actually a protege of another plan, the Howard plan, but he quickly changed alliances when Buckingham came to power. So he associated himself with Cranfield, and he worked side by side with Bacon, Francis Bacon, who was Lord Chancellor at this time. So, well, from 1618 on, Cranfield is actually put in charge of conducting a very wide-reaching reform of the royal departments, seeking to reduce the expenditures. And this is an enormous success. He actually manages to bring the crown budget to balance during a very short time, obviously, but he actually does that. He's able to, because he actually was very well regarded, so he had the power to actually conduct these reforms and not be obstructed. So he did that, and he brought the Crown's budget to a state of balance during the late 1610s. So at this point, his prestige at court really rises enormously. So he becomes a really well-respected figure. In 1619, he became master of the Court of Wards, which was one of the highest posts in the English legal system, judiciary system. And it was also a very lucrative position because it involved fees for concession of wardships and things like that. So he ascends to this very prominent position, and 2 years later, in 1621, amidst the crisis, when the crisis was in full force, he actually became the Lord Treasurer, and 1 year later, in 1622, he entered the peerage. He became the first Earl of Middlesex. So this is a very unique case because it's a remarkable subversion of a tradition of public administration in England. I mean, the Lord Treasurer was always an aristocrat, something that had a background in the aristocracy. And this changes, so you have this businessman that could actually ascend his way until the position of Lord Treasurer, arguably the most influential position at this time. So I think this is a very remarkable case in many respects. A second way of access to the courts, which was obviously much more narrow than the one via financial administration, was what I have called the technical consultations, which were essentially exceptional situations that arose when there was some specific economic problem. So you have a problem, so what you do is you call a group of people that you recognize as experts in that area, people who have knowledge to deal with those matters. So in these occasions, what's interesting to me is that the Crown actually demonstrated a lot of interest and a lot of respect for the opinion of these people. The Crown was willing to call people to help, people of different backgrounds, people of business, people of merchandise, people of banking, of exchange markets, and things like that. They called people to help deal with these problems, and they took their opinions very seriously. But obviously, this only happened in various exceptional situations when you actually had the need to do some, to pursue some action. So this, again, was another occasion where you had business people working side by side with high officers, with people that were involved in high public administration. We have several examples. I think very well known is the 1576 Exchange Commission that included Gresham on the one hand, but also included Burley, Walsingham, Sir Thomas Smith, very well-known officers at that time. So Malin also was involved in the late 16th century commission on exchange matters that had involved also the participation of other high officers. So this was another way of access to courts that was open to people who were business people, essentially, mercantile people. But this only happened, again, occasionally, and it was a much more narrow path than the financial route. But obviously, the severe trade crisis that happened in the early 1610s opened a lot of room for that kind of technical consultation and the participation of these people in public deliberation. So, turning now to the investigation of the crisis itself. So, the first complaints about the crisis reached the Privy Council in early 1620, and the Council took these problems very seriously from the very start. So, it showed awareness that this was probably a very serious problem and tried to deal with it in some way. So there were actually investigative committees that were established by the Privy Council already in early 1620 to try to investigate the state of the cloth trade and other related issues. But the full sense of the crisis only came to the forefront in 1631 when a parliamentary session was called for the first time since 1614. So actually we have a very long period without any parliamentary action from 1614 to 1621. And this is exactly the period when you have a lot of economic difficulties piling up. First you have the Logan Project from 1614 to 17, and then you have the trade crisis. So you have a period of 6 to 7 years of intense economic difficulties where there was no parliamentary action. So people did not actually discuss these things. Those were issues, were grievances that were actually being accumulated. So when Parliament finally meets in 1621, the crisis, for one thing, is finally perceived as a generalized phenomenon because, well, representatives of different counties meet in Westminster and they see that their problems were actually shared by everybody else. So you have this realization that this crisis is actually a kingdom-wide crisis. It's a very generalized phenomenon. And so, again, you have this very marked interest in economic subjects throughout the whole period. For one thing, because this crisis was actually very severe, but on the other hand, because there were economic problems that had been piling up for a long time. So we have economic discussions throughout the whole parliamentary session. So we actually had the creation of two parliamentary committees to investigate economic-related issues, one committee on money, one committee on foreign trade and cluster. So Cranfield, coming back to Cranfield, he was actually involved in the parliamentary debates because he had been elected, obviously through the influence of the Crown, as a member of the Commons. So Cranfield attended the Commons in 1621, and he was actually nominated head of the Money Committee. So Cranfield was the leader of the committee, the parliamentary committee, which was in charge of investigating money issues. Yeah, the problem is that Cranfield, although he had very skills in dealing with practical problems, he appears to not have been a very sociable person. He had problems dealing with people, so he had a way of actually getting people mad at him. So he was not a very popular figure in Parliament. He actually lost the position of leader of Parliament in economic issues to Sir Edmund Sandys, member of the Virginia Company, who was the head of the Trade Committee. But his prestige at court obviously remained very high at this point, and during the summer recession of Parliament, Cranfield then finally became Lord Treasurer, and after Parliament was dissolved early in 1622, Cranfield became the man who led the Privy Council in its efforts to go on with the investigations that had been initiated by Parliament and to try to find ways of dealing with the crisis. So that happens throughout 1622 and 1623, so you have this period when the crisis is still in full force and there is no Parliament, so it falls to the Privy Council to investigate these issues, and so Cranfield is the man who's behind the establishment of several investigative committees which were under the supervision of the Privy Council and which were meant to deal with the crisis, finding solutions for the crisis. Now, what's interesting is that Cranfield had a history with the balance of trade. In 1615, he had actually engaged in an effort together with Sir John Molson, John Molson, who actually was someone who had also been involved with customs tariffs collection and these sorts of things. So the two of them actually engaged in an effort to estimate the balance of trade of England for the period 1613 to 1614. So they actually saw that as a very important instrument to guide the formulation of public policy. So they were very interested in actually trying to come to a complete measure of the balance of trade. And this was an approach that was actually very well received by court. From then on, it seems, when you look at the activity of the Privy Council from 1615 to 21, the period that precedes the crisis, you see that there is a growing interest in the balance of trade as a way of evaluating possible ways of public policy. So this is something that was started by Cranfield in 1615 together with John Molson. And this is something that he kept on doing in 1621 during the parliamentary session. So during the parliamentary debates in 1621, he was actually a very vocal advocate of the balance of trade. So whenever people started to discuss about monetary issues and imbalances in exchange markets, Cranfield would always hastily intervene and say, well, this is not the problem. The problem is the balance of trade. As long as you have an imbalance in the foreign trade between England and other countries, there will always be liquidity crisis, there will always be a scarcity of money, and there will always be a crisis. So Cranfield had been for a long time an advocate of the balance of trade. So the work that was pursued in this investigative committees, this is where our three authors finally come into the picture, Munn, Malin, and Mizzlin. So Munn had actually written his first pamphlet, which was the Discourse of Trade from England to the East Indies in 1621 as an explicit attempt to influence parliamentary proceedings. That was what he was trying to do. He was trying to offer some reasoning to defend the East India Company from blames that were raised against it in the parliamentary arena. So Munn obviously was a member of the East India Company, and his emphasis was always on the global results of the company. You cannot look at only one specific branch of trade. You have to look at the East India Company's operations as a whole, and when you do that, you'll see that, well, that's actually, there is a positive balance of trade going on there. So this is the first effort by Munn. In late 1621, while Parliament was still in session, you have the creation of a Privy Council Committee, a first Privy Council Committee that actually was composed of several MPs, several members of Parliament. And people who had actually been actively involved in the debates that had been carried in Parliament during the past few months. So this committee was created and was supposed to find solutions for the crisis and investigate the problems. But this was a very slow-moving, a very sluggish committee, so they couldn't reach a conclusion until April 1622. So the Privy Council actually got tired of waiting for a report from this committee and dissolved this original committee and created a new one in April 1622, a much smaller group that was composed in part by merchants and in part by public officers, by high court officers. And among the members of this new group was Thomas Munn. And now, what's interesting is that Munn had never before been called to help with any technical consultations. He had never, I mean, several of these people who had been active in Parliament had already been called to help the Crown on other occasions. So they had experience in dealing with these technical consultations that happened from time to time. But Thomas Munn had never before done that. He was virtually unknown at court, as far as I can tell. But then he was called to be a member of this much smaller committee to the detriment of several of his fellow East India Company men who had actually been debating these issues in the parliamentary sphere. So I think that's a very odd pattern that we see here. So at the same time, or at April 1622, you have you have this group of experts, of people with expertise in exchange markets that are asked for a report on the conditions of the exchange market. So again, this is an instance of technical consultations about a very specific issue, in this case, the exchange market. So, and among the experts, the so-called experts that were asked for this report was Gerard Mali. But now, what's interesting is that another member of this group was Sir Robert Cotton, who was a High Court chairman. He was the owner of the Cotton Library. It's very well known in the British Library because of that. The Cotton Library was a bibliophile of sorts. So a person of aristocratic background, a very important, prominent figure at court. But what's more interesting is that Sir Robert Cotton was actually closely related through family linkages to Lord Mandeville, who had been Lord Treasurer before Cranfield and who was currently Lord President of the Privy Council. So Sir Robert Cotton had a very strong connection with a very important figure in this Privy Council sphere of debates. And it was Cotton who probably called Mali to help with this evaluation of the exchange market. So the thing is that both Munn on the one hand and Mali on the other must have been somehow connected to court figures in order to be able to have access to these investigations. So in contrast to what had happened during with the first trade committee, this exchange committee actually elaborated a report very quickly. So a couple of weeks later, you already had a report on the exchange markets on the Privy Council table. And the report concluded that exchange imbalances in the foreign exchange markets were actually the main factor behind the scarcity of money, behind the liquidity crisis that was taking place in England and consequently behind the Great Depression. And this was obviously an interpretation that ran completely contrary to Cranfield's emphasis on the balance of trade. So you have a report that was produced by a group associated with the former Lord Treasurer that runs country in the interpretation favored by the current Lord Treasurer. So you have a problem here. So what happens very curiously is that this report, this original report, was submitted to the evaluation of a second group. And this second group was composed exclusively of merchants, and among them was, once again, Thomas Munn. So obviously this second group reached diametrically opposite conclusions. They said that no, the main factor behind the crisis is the balance of trade. It's not the exchange markets. So at this point you have a polarization of the debate. So you have one group that is defending the prominence of the prominent causality running from exchange markets, and another group that is defending the balance of trade as the main factor behind the crisis. And what happens is that the discourse at this time becomes much more radicalized, so you have much more uncompromising positions that are arising at this moment. Now, what's interesting is that, and this is something that when I found out about this, I was really excited, is that Munn and Cranfield actually had connections that dated far back. They had been associated in business relationships when Cranfield was still in the city, before he was Lord Treasurer. So they had been engaged in land deals together and other sorts of financial arrangements. At some point, apparently, Munn lended money to Cranfield in order to finance the speculation. So they had connections that dated far back. And what's interesting is that from 1621, from when Munn writes the discourse, to his activity during the work of the investigative committees in 1622 and 1623, there is a very marked change in attitude. So in the 1621 pamphlet, Munn was actually ready to admit that monetary mechanisms could play a very important place, a very important role in determining the force of an economic crisis. I mean, monetary factors could actually be a very important factor. He was ready to admit that. And that's something that completely disappears in 1622 during his activity in the Privy Council committees, and is obviously completely absent in England's Treasury by Foreign Trade, which was published posthumously in 1664. So there is a marked change in Munn's attitude from 1621 to 1622. And that change obviously coincides with Munn's sudden ascension to a position of public importance in the investigations that were led by the Privy Council. So I think that's a very telling coincidence. At the end of 1622, by the suggestion of the original Trade Committee, a body, an investigative body was created, which was called the Standing Commission for Trade, which was a body that was actually supposed to meet continuously from then on. So this was actually the stage when these confrontations that had been initiated in 1622 were played out throughout 1623. So if you had this conflict between the group of Munn on the one hand and the group of Malines on the other. And while Munn was actually called to be a member of the Standing Commission, but Malines was not. But then you had other people that belonged to the group of Malines, such as Madison, Sir Ralph Madison for one thing, and Sir Robert Cotton, who were members of the Standing Commission. So the debates were carried on in this new arena that was created. So this is how the things were played out in the investigative committees. On the other hand, you also have the pamphlets. And the pamphlets, I think this is very important. The pamphlets actually come about at a very late stage, when the debate was already well underway. A lot of things had already happened. The pamphlets first came to the first come to the forefront. So the controversy in print was actually between Mizzlin and Malines, and not between Malines and Munn. Munn had written a pamphlet in 1621, and his other pamphlet would only be published in 1664 after he was long dead. So the controversy in print was between Malines and Mizzlin, and it was started actually by Mizzlin in 1622 when he published Free Trade, or the Means to Make Trade Flourish, which contained an open criticism of one of Maline's projects for the establishment of the Office of Royal Exchange. So I think what's curious, I'm actually running out of time, so I'm very close to the end too. So, but I think what's curious is that, well, Malines argues very similarly in both fronts. He argues in the same manner in the public committees that he argues in the pamphlets. His line of reasoning is roughly the same. Whereas Mizzlin, as had happened already with Munn, presents very different arguments in his first pamphlet, the 1622 pamphlet, than the ones that actually appeared in the 1623 pamphlet called The Circle of Commerce or The Balance of Trade. So there is, again, a very marked change in arguments between these two pamphlets. And that coincides with an approximation between Mizzlin and the group that was well, the merged group, the East India Company group. Mizzlin actually, in late in 1622, was appointed an ambassador of the East India Company in the Low Countries. So he there was a merchant adventurer, a member of a rival group of the East India Company, actually was brought together. He gradually approximated to the group of the East India Company. And that also coincides with the change in emphasis. starts to emphasize the importance of the balance of trade behind the trade crisis. So, to conclude, I think there are 2 points that I'm trying to make here that are the most important conclusions that I extract from this whole explanation. Well, the first of them has to do with what I have called the omnipresence of Cranfield. So this, again, was a member of the business elite, which was a rather unique case of a person of such background that could actually reach a very prominent position at court. He became the Lord Treasurer, the person who was actually in charge of conducting public policy in England. That is very rare. It's unique. As far as I know, it had never happened before. And well, what happens is that with Cranfield occupying such a prominent position, this obviously offered a channel of communication for people of business and merchant backgrounds to dialogue with this Lord Treasurer who could actually understand much better what they were trying to say. So, well, for one thing, Cranfield could exert a very strong impact on public policy. And I think people recognize that he actually had this very strong power. And what I'm trying to say is that, well, you can see in Mizzlin, when he writes the 1623 pamphlet, the Circle of Commerce of the Balance of Trade, that he tries, on the one hand, to compliment Munn as a very experienced, very important, very respected merchant. But also, he praises very highly the figure of Cranfield. The pamphlet is actually dedicated to Cranfield, who was by then Lord Treasurer. And what Mizzlin tries to emphasize in the dedicatory epistle is that, well, Cranfield's main contribution to English public policy was the fact that he had recovered the concept of the balance of trade. He actually says that. Your masterpiece, and that the work by which the crown and the king recognized you, was the balance of trade. This is your legacy to posterity. So Mizzlin explicitly recognizes that Cranfield, who had this focus on the balance of trade, was a very important figure. And also Malin recognized that, and this is also something that when I found out, I was pretty excited. Malin wrote a pamphlet in 1623, a mercantile campaign called Lex Migratoria, and he actually tried to dedicate this work to Cranfield. He wrote a letter to Cranfield asking for permission to dedicate this work to the Lord Treasurer. But the pamphlet was later published in that same year without this dedication. So supposedly Cranfield denied the authorization. So I think that's the point. Cranfield was a very, he was a figure of reference for all these people. They were looking at him and they were trying to gain the confidence of the Lord Treasurer. Some couldn't, and some could, and some couldn't. And obviously Cranfield had no use for someone who thought that exchange markets were more important than the balance of trade, which was the case of Malin. The second conclusion is that, well, what was then the role of all these experts, these so-called experts? I think that that's to an extent is a rather obvious conclusion, but a conclusion that has been overpassed by the literature so far, is that at this moment, direct action at court was the main path open for influencing public policy. So publishing pamphlets is not a very good way of convincing a Lord Treasurer to do what you want to do. So writing and publishing pamphlets, which is what Malin and Mizzlin were doing, was actually at best a second best option for trying to influence the course of public events. And I think that finds a reflection, on the one hand, in the posthumous publication of England's Treasury of Foreign Trade, that appears only in 1664. So Thomas Munn was not very interested in publishing his writings. He left it for his son to do that. And Lionel Cranfield as well, who was the person who could actually do things his own way, dictate the course of public policy, he had no interest in writing pamphlets as well. So there is no literary record by Cranfield. So, and if that is the case, maybe it's the case that also we have been looking in the wrong place the whole time.
I'm very interested in this case. Supple was my first teacher of economic history. until, well, sometime in the late 17th century, there really isn't such a thing as public opinion in England. There's earlier, I think, public opinion in Holland. So I think the way things happen in Holland in the middle of the 16th century is through courts and so on, through aristocrats. But by rather early, maybe in the same period in Holland, public opinion starts to matter, but it does not matter in England until much later. And I think that's your point, that the pamphlets are nice, but they're sort of after the fact, and they're not how things get done. And I'm also interested in this Cranfield character, because as you say, he's not the first influential member of the bourgeoisie. After all, Thomas Cromwell was the son of a butcher, and so forth. But this rapid rise to the heights of established power and to enter England's very tiny peerage, it is worth pointing out, you might want to, if you haven't made this point, you might want to add it, that the peerage in England was very small. But it was small by European standards. So my interest comes from interest in what we always call the rise of the bourgeoisie, and I'm not care for that expression, but anyway, the beginnings of a shift from a society where the only honor came from being an aristocrat to finally, by say the early 18th century, a society in which there was honor in trade and innovation.
So, well, this topic of the presence or absence of public opinion in English is actually a very hot topic among intellectual historians these days. Because you have works of Stephen Pinker, Peter Lake, and people like that who are actually trying to come to grips with this problem. Was actually there public opinion or not? I think, well, obviously, if there was, it was very, very restricted. It was limited to a very small circle. But I think there is, the very existence of the pamphlets tells something about that. In the sense that, I'm sure that several people here have already seen physically one of these pamphlets, how they look like.
Yeah.
They're very small editions, very cheap editions that were meant to be carried in your pocket and sold for very little money for people who actually couldn't afford to pay an expensive edition. So these were not books that were meant to be put in the shelves of aristocrats. And so if they were not, I mean, to whom were they writing? So there must be some kind of public opinion as restricted as it must be. Yeah. I think it was pretty much restricted to the city of London. And to this.
I think that's right.
Yeah, but I mean, there is an audience there. They're writing to someone. I think that's an important point to be made.
By the way, you can educate me on this. Where were these pamphlets published? In London itself or in Amsterdam?
In London, yeah. You have London printing houses.
So they
yeah.
were allowed to.
Yeah.
There was nothing illegal about.
No. There was nothing illegal. They were printed in London. But what's interesting is that in this period you also have a lot of pamphlets that come about, and then I think this is a very interesting research topic actually. Unfortunately, I don't speak Dutch, so I would have a problem to do that. But
it's easy.
What's that?
It's easy to.
But there are actually a number of pamphlets that come about at this time as supposed translations of Dutch works.
Yeah.
So to what extent they were actually translations of Dutch work, or they were just framed this so because Holland was such this model for commercial behavior at this time. This is a question that I think is very, very worth addressing. Well, there's about the size of the English peerage. Well, you're right, it was very small compared to continental centers, but during the Jacobean era, you actually have expansion. So I don't.
Notorious.
Yeah. So I mean, there is somehow a vulgarization of.
And by the way, it's worth pointing out that that state finance, even the land of the king, was a small part of national income. It's sort of easy to fall into the habit of thinking of like the Greek case or something. It's not like that. These are very small sums. A very small percentage of national income is used for any public purpose. And this was a constant problem for the English kings until they got a king from Holland.
Yes, exactly. It's true, and well, it's a very small percentage of the income, and yeah, of the national income. Well, anyway, there's another point about the prestige of the business people. Yeah. I just wanted to make a quick remark about that because it's interesting because there is in some sense Cranfield is very prestigious at court. I mean, he's called. His services are in high demand, but on the other hand, he's always regarded as this guy who wasn't supposed to be there. So there's a very famous remark by Francis Bacon.
It was a terrible snob.
Yeah, everybody hated him, but Bacon actually remarked when Cranfield presented a project that had to do with a proposal for tariff reform, for protectionist tariff reform. Bacon said something to the content that. Well, this is a very nice project considering this man's background. Considering that, I mean, considering that he's a London apprentice, those were his words. So I think, there is prestige, but it's a very specific kind of prestige. They were not seen as equals.
David, did you have something on this point? Okay, brilliant.
Did anybody worry about conflict of interest?
Sure. Well. This is something that I was thinking about that during Michael's presentation 2 days ago. Well, Michael focused on this thing about these people being crooks and people who were always engaged in scheming and shady deals. And well, I think it's true of economic pamphleteers, but it's true of mostly everybody else.
It's true of Francis.
It's certainly true of Francis Bacon. He's the biggest schemer of all. He was actually impeached on corruption charges.
He was the Lord Chancellor, the highest legal officer in England, and he sold opinions on both sides of cases. That is, he would promise people that he would find for them, and then he'd promise their opponent that he'd find for them, and he'd take bribes from both.
Yeah, Bacon was really good support. He was impeached actually during the Parliament of 1621, the one I've been talking about. So the first 2 months of Parliament are dedicated to impeaching Bacon, taking him out of power. But the thing is that this is, as I see it, this is a very opportunistic society. It's a society where if you have the chance of material profiting from your position, you do it, and you're not going to be frowned upon by your peers. The only problem is if Parliament decides to hunt you down. That's the only occasion when you're going to have trouble. Otherwise, it's just nobody's going to look at you as some immoral or wrong person. It's seen naturally, as far as I can tell.
First of all, you're telling us that Bacon qualifies as an unbiased expert. Great paper. I enjoyed it. Would you help me in my ignorance and give us a thumbnail sketch of the different policy recommendations of the three pamphleteers?
Well, you see, the policy recommendations initially during the parliamentary debates, they're very confusing. They're very mixed. You have different policies being recommended side by side, so there is no clear hierarchy between causes and possible remedies. But as it appears in Mann and Malin, in the pamphlets themselves, well, Munn, well, the later Munn, the balance of trade Munn, he is always very focused on the balance of trade. So it's always about importing less, exporting more, diminishing conspicuous consumption, and being more frugal and working more and adding more, creating more value for the labor. It's always about that. Whereas Malin was always trying to, and I think this is the big polarization here, he's always trying to regulate the exchange market. He's trying to make sure that exchange operations are conducted according, not to the exact bar, metallic bar of exchange, as he called it, but following that rule, not deviating significantly from that. So I think the problem is that you have international imbalances in exchange markets, and those imbalances actually create the opportunity for continuous arbitrage, international arbitrage that was actually, and I think this goes back to the point that David made during Michael's presentation about the transition from silver to gold and the alchemy thing. I actually think, I was talking to Michael about that, I actually think there's a much more prosaic explanation for that, in the sense that during the whole of the 17th century, England was fighting against outflow of silver. So you had this constant arbitrage of international markets that took silver out of England and brought gold in, because the metallic ratio between England and the continent was always imbalanced. England always had a lower ratio, gold-silver ratio, than the continent. So as I see, and this is not me saying that, there are historians that can argue this point. What happens is that when England finally has, you have the late 17th century financial reforms, and you actually have a medium of exchange that doesn't depend strictly on the metal itself, they just say, well, screw silver, let's go with gold. With silver, we just can't keep it inside.
This is just a point of clarification. You said that you referred to these two different views. One was that the balance of payments was in imbalance, balance of payments deficit. The other one was that you said the exchange market was disrupted. You're talking about the foreign exchange rate relative to the gold parity. So they were talking about the exchange rate being depreciated. That made the common currency price of gold higher in the rest of the world. It wasn't driven, so gold was flowing out.
Yeah.
Is that what they're referring to when this disruption in the exchange market?
Yeah, the disruption in the exchange markets is exactly that. What you have is that this question is actually framed differently by different authors. So people, you don't have a very well-established terminology, so the discourse is different. They don't argue in the same way. They don't use the same words. But basically, the argument is that, well, as I said just now to David, it's the gold-silver ratio in England is lower than it is in the continent. So gold is more valued in England, and silver is more valued in continental Europe. So you have this arbitrage. So people are all constantly taking silver out of England and bringing gold in, because there are arbitrage gains to be had there. And also, I mean, the metallic system, the monetary system at this time is very, very complicated. So you have these fictitious currencies that actually serve as unit of account, but they don't circulate, they don't serve as medium of exchange. So it's very hard for the government, especially on a bimetallic system, to actually regulate the value of money. So it's very tricky.
Did the monetary school, did they have the insight that both balance of payments imbalances and the pressure in the exchanges could both be due to a common factor, a monetary factor, or was that not recognized until David came?
Sorry, I didn't understand.
Well, you know, one said the main cause of our difficulties is balance of payments. Another said the main cause is the exchange market.
Yes.
Did anybody say that both are the result of a common cause, namely a monetary imbalance?
Well, I think what Malin and his fellows are trying to argue is that the main cause is the monetary imbalance. And this monetary imbalance actually causes trade imbalances. You have different terms of trade, and that's what they're trying to argue.
So that insight was that early. I mean, that was what David Hume said.
Yeah, well, I would say so.
I guess there are many pamphlets published without the name of author. I'm interested in what was the importance of authorship in pamphlet in this period. Did the writing pamphlets help someone to build the career, or and also I missed the point. I how did Crownfield become so important? Because despite his power.
Okay. Well, the thing with authorship, I think there is a huge effort to when the person wants to be known. That's the point. And sometimes you're writing things and you don't want to be identified. Like that's pretty much universal. So if you're arguing something that you think people are not going to like very much, so you just keep it anonymous or you just use initials. That happens. It happens quite often. But I think, well, on the part of these authors that actually are proud of their ideas and they're not afraid of exposing them, there is a huge effort in trying to establish not only authorship but expertise. So they normally describe themselves as, wow, written by Jared Malin, a merchant of very great experience and who has worked with this and that. And during the course of the text, they normally say, well, back when I was a member of the Privy Council Commission and we dealt with these things, and there I interacted with Lord Burleigh and with Sir Thomas Walsingham. So there's also this attempt to establish expertise, to actually claim importance for one's own opinion. I don't know if that's what you're doing.
You're sort of embarrassment of the already established reputation.
What's that? Sorry.
So you're the kind of how do you say it, a company. So the reputation.
Yeah, I think so.
Established, and then they are trying to make it more impressive.
Yeah, exactly. Again, it's all rhetoric. They're always trying to somehow bring more strength to their argument. No. Well, there's probably a bit of both, but as I see it, people who wrote pamphlets were people who were not getting heard at court. Their voices were not heard, and then they looked for a second opinion. So probably what they're trying to do is they want to be heard. That's the main objective.
I'm trying to move us on. Just got
Okay.
two more comments, and I want to make sure we don't continue to like David quickly.
Oh, just like Deirdre, I feel young again. This is I haven't heard these names taken this seriously as in Jack Batish's course in Berkeley, and Jack, of course, covers one of the really obscure figures, Isaac Gervais or something, even the name. But on the pamphlets and the scenes, one of the problems scholars have pointed out that we have to be really careful about is we tend to think that big books, which are important in some sense, are important in other sense. And the example that's coming up to the fore now is, when you look back at the Gutenberg printing press, think, gee, the Gutenberg Bible is a really big deal. Well, in some sense, of course it is. But in another sense, well, it was why they went bankrupt. What they made their money on, was printing indulgences. And this was a job shop. They would print indulgences by the reams, and so you got hyperinflation in salvation at price. And so if you look at this from a printing thing, maybe this sort of economic controversy is important for printers because it sells pamphlets. And so that if you get a fight going, you get a debate going, then you can sell pamphlets. And so that the printing, the role of printers and publishing might be something to take into account in this or something. There's something that's going on in sort of printing history which sort of motivates this question.
I'm going to let you answer David later and let my hand have a word, and then we'll.
Just quickly, some of the committees were parliamentary committees, is that right?
Yeah, well, there were two parliamentary committees, and then, well, after Parliament was adjourned.
Right, so I guess my question is, how much of calling both these committees and having Cranfield as the Lord Treasurer, et cetera, was due just to political expediency? And by that I mean the actual conflict between Crown and Parliament. How much were they trying to sort of buy with each other? So they were trying to get merchants on their side, for example, and just any sort of opinion on their side, versus an actual concern for public policy, economic policy, or even in the case of the Crown, just the need for money. Does the question make sense?
Right. Yeah. Do you want me to answer?
Or, yeah, you can answer it, right?
How about real quickly, and then we can take it out.
Okay, I just want to make one point, is that, I think Parliament is really not the best forum for looking at the ideas themselves, because the ideas in Parliament always come up really, really tainted by other agendas. So they're always matched with other things. So for instance, the prohibition of, these debates, the initial debates on the balance of trade and on how to deal with the crisis actually led to only one important policy conclusion, which was to forbid the importation of Spanish tobacco. So it's really, that's not the point. That's because these people just use these things to pursue their own agendas. So the debate always gets carried to other issues. So I think in Parliament there's a lot of that going on, always, all the time. But then in the Privy Council it's a more frank and open debate, because people are not really, well, obviously there are always interests to be considered, but there's the petitions are much more formally debated. Some people arguing against each other. They're actually writing and trying to come up with a reasonable explanation for things.
You have probably said more words in the last time. Yeah, you talk so fast, we get so much in there, it's just amazing. So let's take So 15 minutes, and then back here for the final session.
I have to go. Thank you all for your
Let's thank Deirdre.
I've seen some old friends. That guy there is my student. He's my best student. He's already here.